Hello, Sue. How are you?
Doing well, Katie. Good to see you.
Yes. So obviously, this is the second time that we've met to do a recording about 3D work in apparel design. And so I wanted just to introduce you again. Um, Sue Kagan is the founder of DCS, Design Cycle Solutions, and she is our fearless leader CEO, but also an apparel engineer with extensive background in creating fit for various brands. So all the charting, all of the dynamics of the math that go into fit, Sue has been responsible for. And she's worked on very impressive supply chains, such as the children's model supply chain, which is very large. So today we're going to talk about the weedy problems interfering with implementing 3D, which can be very extensive. So I just want to get Sue's initial take on the subject, and then we'll jump into questions.
Well, first of all, Katie, thank you for arranging this. And I wanted to, at the outset, say that the assumption that the target audience of people who would be listening to this are interested in understanding how to best use 3D for sample making and for approval, sample approval. And we're also making the assumption that the viewer has some knowledge and experience about the difficulties and blockages that are interfering with a smooth rollout of this process. The other premise of this is that the efficiency of the brand's merchandising, design, product development, technical design, production, and e-com departments can be quantified by the efficiency of the sample approval process. That's how we mark the progress of going from an idea into production. The sell-through is understanding what interferes with that sample approval process. And the real question here then is, can 3D do what we now, most of the industry does in physical? Can some of that, if not much of it, be done in 3D? And what would it take for a brand to be able to actually implement that? The other part of this assumption is, and the reality is, and all you have to do is go look at any brand's product, is that each brand is unique. It's just like a singer. Every singer, you can tell by one note who that singer is. Brands are like that. And if they're not like that, they fade away. It's because of their uniqueness and their point of view and their understanding of their consumer and their ability to give that to the consumer over time and over years that they have sustainability. That should not be interfered with because it's working. It's clearly working. However, why does the apparel industry still have such a high return rate, specifically for fit? And the question is, can 3D actually improve that? So the fundamental question that Katie is a deep expert on, and I have some working real hands-on knowledge of, is what are the basic tools needed for 3D? What actually is needed in order to go from doing a design sample, a production sample. So which area, the first question that a brand needs to ask itself is, which part of the sample approval process are they asking to transform into 3D? Not every brand has the same aims, but part of this talk is to allow those who are in the responsible position of trying to understand how to implement 3D can best make the clearest decision about which solutions, which platforms, which kind of avatar, because you can't go there without an avatar. So if your brand hasn't well defined what your base body is, you're going to have a big problem deciding what kind of avatar that you're going to use. Because if you don't know the dimensions and the form, and you're dependent upon a fit model that may change over time, or maybe your fit has moved and changed. So you really need to understand what your base size is. And then how are you going to use it? Which part of the design cycle? Is it only going to stay in ideation? Do you only use it with your merchandising and design department?
So and this is where I'm going to just ask a question. In order to implement 3D and really address the fit problem within a brand, right? We need to first address the avatar's relationship to the customer, obviously, which is kind of what you were outlining there. So the question is how important is the efficacy of an avatar in the implementation of 3D? And how important is it that you have the 3D technician who understands fit modifications in that process and relationship? Because quite frankly, I think that if you have a head of innovation that comes from a purely three-dimensional background, but does not have any pattern drafting skills within that process, there's going to always be a misstep somewhere in the workflow that must occur between the teams and the factory level to really have a successful output into e-commerce, not just from the imaging, but also from the declarations of data that you're listing out, whether it's in your specs or saying it's made for a curvy body, or even the height that it was made for, right? Those are declarations that are missing, quite honestly, in the e-commerce. And so what's your take on that? Because I think that's one of those weedy zones of the importance of the type of drafter working in the 3D and what they know and what they don't know against the avatar. And then, of course, how it interacts in the e-commerce field.
Well, it's essential. And the reason why I focus immediately on the base body of the brand is that right there, you have to define by stature, stance, dimension, and the avatar that you're going to use. If you're going to use it to actually portray accurately what a garment looks like on that avatar, the avatar has to be accurate. What my experience is that they're squishy. The avatars are not that accurate. And I personally am fitting to an accuracy of 1/4 of an inch. I want my avatar to be matching to that. And right here is the point of where the brand has to define for itself who they are, which is really great in this particular period of time, because it's very related to the high rate of returns. It's because the brand doesn't know exactly who it is. And maybe the brand needs more than one avatar. Maybe they need 2 different fits. Maybe that's what they're actually doing. But if someone who's making those decisions doesn't understand pattern making, doesn't understand fit and what it really is, and how to convey that to the decision makers who are going to pay for this, 3D gets clogged up from the very beginning.
So would you say that it might be an absolutely kind of fixed point in the future that brands own their pattern making in-house and then they can hand it over to the factories so that there's more control in that process?
Well, the brands that have out of the box gone have in my experience, and I've worked with several of them, who actually went from kitchen tables to billions of dollars within a very short period of time. That's exactly what they did. They have that in common. They controlled their patterns. Liz Claiborne, the gold standard of consistency of fit, controlled every single pattern, every marker, wash standards, completely controlled, and it paid off in this multi-billion-dollar business. When they left that control, that business began to degrade. So the reality is that right now we have designers who are designing who have no idea who the pattern maker is that makes their pattern. There's that connection has been broken, and it's showing up. I believe, I know, actually, I could show, I've actually proved it, that it shows up in the high rate of returns, because the brand runs out of time. They approve things before they're really perfected, or they really just don't know how to do it. And so this industry could really benefit now in this particular period of time if it could implement 3D in all three phases of the design cycle, because it will allow the brand to actually control their patterns, because you can't do it without controlling your pattern.
So, this is a question more pertaining to even a person who wants to start their brand, right? And then we can kind of get into the weeds of the design cycle. But I know that we have a lot of people that get into fashion. They don't know anything about how a garment is made or where it comes from. And most often they get started by using white label processes, right? So they go to the factory, they find a model of something that they like, and then they just have it made. And they might bring in products from like 5 or 6 different factories, right? So now you've got 5 or 6 different fits, and because you don't know the origin body, you don't know a whole lot of things. And so I think those types of brand builders that may be the future of our industry may need to understand why it's important to hire a person that can orchestrate fit models, that can really educate the owners on what that modeling looks like. And I know your experience at Esprit is very much in line with that, as well as Carter's even. So if you can elaborate on just, in layman's terms, for those types of people that need to understand why it's important to have an in-house pattern maker or a person that's commanding that fit protocol for their brand and how it can pay off for them, that would be great, because I think that that's a large part of our market that we're going to see in the future, and we can help them immensely.
Yes, I mean, it starts off with a very simple base. Who are you going to fit? What sample size are you using? You have to start somewhere. That's a human body. What is that human body? What's its age? What's its dimension? What's its stature? What's its stance? And then, if you want to start off a brand, it starts with that concept. I only want to make clothes that fit for me. Fine, no problem. At least you're starting from what it is that you know. But the need for someone who can accurately map out what that, and engineer, it really is engineering. You can build a house without a design, without an architect, but you can't build it without an engineer.
Yeah.
It's the same for apparel. You have to have solid engineering. And if the thing about why apparel is so difficult is because it's always in relationship, the item, the apparel item is always in relationship to a body underneath it. That already puts you into 30 different areas of the body that have to fit. If your engineering isn't correct from the very beginning, you're doomed to go through more samples than you would need to. I know from experience, it's possible to go from a first sample into a production sample. That's it. You can do that.
Mhm.
But in order to do that, you need an engineer who can understand patterns and ideally is a pattern maker. Is the
Mhm.
best investment in new designer or a new person who wants to start a brand is a solid technical design engineer / pattern maker. If you can find that combo in one and keep them at your side, your chances of success are much, much stronger. And if you lift the layers of every successful company, if you really go back and look at, you're going to see standing next to that designer was an incredible pattern maker.
Mhm. I would agree. And that kind of gets me into this next question, which is, so let's say you're a head of innovation or you're a CFO of a company, and obviously you've been reading about the wave of 3D implementation, and you are trying to really orchestrate a team to head up that innovation, because quite frankly, your head of innovation may be actually separate or different from your technical design or pattern making team. But at some point, it's got to be unified, right? So what would you suggest to that head of innovation or CFO that is looking to implement uh, any kind of innovation, and what they really, really need to know, and what are the essential roles within the 3D apparel supply chain that you think can truly make impact, both from a waste perspective, but also obviously the stockholders' bottom line of how are we innovating, like the lip service.
Right. Well, it comes back to the old story. It's about roles and responsibilities, and they need to be defined. But in order to understand a role and responsibility, you have to understand what the job is and who does it and when do they do it and how is it done, which comes back to the question that you're asking is, where do you start? You start from the position of what is it, where do you want that, how robust a 3D implementation do you want to implement in your brand? Right now, I see a lot of heads of innovation focusing on the back end, on e-com only. Let's use 3D, let's use 3D there or AI there. But to me, that's very short-sighted and does not really maximize the return on the investment. If you're going to invest in 3D, you should be, I personally feel that it should be used in the whole of the design cycle. It should be able to get up, walk, dance, and sing through all of the design cycle. That means it goes from the merchandiser being able to use it for decision making, the designer being able to use it for decision making, the technical designer being able to use it for decision making, the production manager being able to understand and use it for quality control, for real factory visualization. So there's no reason why a robust implementation of 3D with a real avatar that can go is able to function and perform in the different platforms that it's going to need to function in, which is where I feel that the heads of innovation don't understand the main difficulty about 3D implementation has to do with its lack of stability from one platform to another and the distortions that are occurring. These can be solved, but they have to be factored into the decision making of what you're going to choose for an avatar and for your 3D platforms, who can use it, what your factories can use. Yeah, there's a lot of research that has to go into this, and soul searching and understanding what you really want out of it.
So would you, I mean, from a perspective of design cycle solutions and what we are practiced in, how would you say that we could possibly help those companies through that process, from our organization to their organization?
So it gets very simple because we understand what can and cannot be done with 3D, which I don't think most people really do. Otherwise, they would be doing things very differently. So we can actually go through a very quick process review with a brand and help them focus in on what it is their goals and aims are for 3D and what their long-term plan is. And we can map out that process and quantify it and put a budget to it and consult to get it implemented successfully and turn it over. And it can go pretty quickly.
And would you say that only because we've been able to do this with other people is that we understand the constraints of the time issues that a lot of the team members face, but also I would say it's the bridging the uncanny valley of 2D to 3D where the brain shifts. And we understand that there's also a time constraint to the brain shifting from the 2D models that they're used to into the 3D model, and then even 4D, right? So how would you discuss or elaborate on what that process looks like based on our own experience?
Well, based on our experience, it's evaluating the skill set of the current people who are working on not only in technical design. It has a lot to do with the openness and willingness of the merchandising team and the design team to be willing to look at an avatar with a 3D garment on it. Now, understanding what they can see and what they can't see is the very beginning of the process. So maybe they can't see a garment on just like they can't see a garment on a dress form. They're going to have a hard time seeing it on an avatar that doesn't have hair, skin, shoes, has mobility, has more lifelike conformation. They're not going to be able to see it. So it has a lot to do with the open willingness to take on looking at a 3D image of a garment when you're only used to seeing it in materiality. So what part of the biggest problem also in this whole implementation process is the belief, not the knowledge, but the belief that you cannot fit approve on a dress form. And if your brand is in that place where it cannot get past this point of understanding that approval on a dress form is very possible for a production garment, you're going to have a hard time implementing 3D for this process. So it's also understanding where your brand is, where the brand is in terms of the mindset and the willingness for change within the people who are actually making decisions about this approval of a sample.
Mm-hmm.
But because we have experience about understanding what's there, we have some ability to provide solutions that will allow people to comfortably and actually quite lucratively use 3D in the process of approval that will, in fact, really reduce iterations and also really tighten up the fit.
Yes, I would absolutely agree with that. Especially the fact that we have seen, the actual creative ingenue designers not being able to actually understand the fit protocols because they're too focused on the avatars, aesthetic. And so we are capable of training to, like overlook that and really start to get to the root cause of a garment, because at the end of the day, if that's not right, we're just again adding to the piles of landfills. And really that also gets me down to you know a question that's more about your own journey and your own pathway in the process of learning 3D, because like anything, you were open to having to learn a new skill when you probably weren't ready for it, but you had to, learn it in order to really understand where the future of the industry was going, right?
Yes, and the I this question was really very difficult for me at the very beginning, because I was asked to work on technology platforms that really weren't ready for the industry.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the difficulties. And when I started to really go in and look at what 3D platforms in terms of pattern making, pattern capture really can and cannot do, I saw a lot of difficulties in terms of being able to execute pattern corrections. There are limitations about what you can and cannot do in a 3D pattern system. I mean, I'm a hands-on draper, so there are certain things that have to be done in the material world, but they can very quickly be transferred. I mean, within an hour into 3D. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we've proven it. I mean, it doesn't mean that I'm an expert at 3D, at the actual pattern making system. I'm not, but I've worked side by side with people who maybe don't understand fit and pattern making, and we have excellent results. So what is needed is someone who actually really, it comes back to the pattern making. If you don't understand how to correct a pattern, you're going to have a real difficult time implementing 3D in its highest and best use. There's just no way around it.
So would you say, in terms of, like, if I had to make an investment in hiring, right? Um, would you say that it's more important to bring in, a stabilized team of pattern makers and technical designers with the 3D background, and maybe go a little bit lighter on the number of creatives that are doing that kind of work in 3D, and really invest it into the technical design and pattern makers? Or would you do the opposite and have the, like hire a bunch of freelancers to be just assembling the pattern and rendering it out in 3D? Like, what would you suggest is the best pipeline for that kind of, for like, let's say, a mid-sized to large company?
Well, unless you have a very, very deep relationship with a very good factory that has that skill set, you need to do it in-house. And it doesn't mean that you're doing every pattern in-house. You don't have to do every pattern in-house, but you need to build out your base. What is your brand signature? The parts of the garment that are your brand signature it's really how you build your brand. You have a point of view. You need to express it. And even if you're a young designer, you may be a little bit fuzzy about certain things, but a good pattern maker is going to give you the strength and the understanding to find your own eye and to begin to build it out consistently. It will also help you get better samples back from your factory, because a skilled pattern maker who can create a production pattern will deliver balanced patterns from the very beginning, which also means, why would you invest money in a whole process of ideation that can't be turned quickly into production? This makes no sense to me. Just because you want to see something quickly doesn't mean that that's your long-term goal is that you want to be able to get that garment to market.
Which goes back to owning the pattern.
Exactly. And also that you're building, a brand is always building off of their last best success. So if you don't control that pattern, you're giving away your gold, because that's what you're really building your future on. Only 5 to 7% of a semi-established brand is really high innovation, my experience. It doesn't, you need newness, you need innovation, you need sparkle, you need razzle dazzle. So again, that takes a skilled pattern maker. Maybe if you're a dress house, you need a draper, that, and understanding what your brand needs in terms of what its signature is. And also understanding why you get fit returns. If you don't understand your core pattern, you probably can't understand where the fit might have not be working.
Yeah.
And you won't be able to draw down that information and use it to avoid fit problems in the future.
Well, and I would say that's another thing that DCS is good at, especially more in my wheelhouse, where I do the dissemination and analyzation of why people are saying it doesn't fit. So because it's not always that it's made poorly, it's that it's communicated incorrectly to the consumer or lack thereof, right? And the consumer themselves today, because we have a whole generation that never got like an interface with somebody who is explaining body shape and all of that, the nuances that go into fit, when you decide on what brand might work best for you, right? They don't have any of that experience or knowledge. And so they're really starting from a place of like, I don't know, it works, I guess. And so they just put on whatever. And that's why we have a whole generation of sweatsuit wearers, because they don't really understand why something is feeling off to them. And that is something that makes it very hard for them to even convey back to the brand, because they have no compass when it comes to figuring out, why does this pant feel like super tight in the front and like it, but it's gaping in the back? Like, they don't understand that there's a balance issue there, and that they might just have to go try another brand, right?
Well, so you're raising a whole big question around how to understand the reason for return, and that comes back to the stabilized base body. If you as a brand don't have a stabilized, balanced base body, then the chance that you're going to get returns goes way up, because we're not, because in order to do mass market, you can't build off a customized body, because it narrows who your customer base is. So understanding your ideal and then communicating that to your customer allows your customer to understand whether or not that ideal is going to work for their preference. So a lot of this could be, a lot of the fit issues could be solved simply by flowing data that already exists in the tech pack in the right way to the consumer.
Yeah.
So having a solid engineering at the very start of the creative process not only eliminates a lot of iterations, It solves the design questions very quickly, because a solid pattern maker or engineer is going to work with the designer straight away to solve those problems. And an experienced engineer and pattern maker will be able to say, this won't work, or it will work in production. It's the other part of it. So you might go all the way down the road, love your idea, but realize that you can never produce it. So this question of starting off on the right foot is essential to the success, not only of the brand, but of 3D as well. And it really comes back to, what do you want to use it for? What do you want to use your 3D for? Where do you want your avatar to go? Do you want your avatar only to be a dress form, or do you want it to look like your ideal person? And if so, where's that avatar going to go? Through all the sampling process, or are you going to cut it off at e-com, where you could at e-com, if you so chose, to show your consumer all the size range on an avatar.
Okay.
So they could actually make a much more intelligent choice. So there are some good uses for this.
So, and this is more or less my last question, because I feel like this question is very important from the purview of pattern making and draping. And that is how AI plays a role in that, and how anybody working on a current pattern making system for AI, do you think that they are ethical, misguided? Like, what are your thoughts on pattern making today with AI, and the efficacy of those patterns?
Well, I've looked at some of them, I've looked at many patterns that have been generated, so-called AI. And to me, they're ill-fitting and really don't, I mean, they're off, they're wrong, they don't work, they're off balance. To me, it's deceptive, and it's not working yet. I mean, pattern making is incredibly complicated. And the reality is that many pattern making systems do not allow you to correct a pattern the way you would in physical. So it's already built away from how the physical world actually works. And AI is even moving further away from that. So it's a lack of understanding of the math and the physics. It's a wrong understanding of the actual math and physics of how patterns really work and how fabrics really work. So it's not going where, and those people are getting a lot of funding for something that is going to not solve the fit problem at all. It's going
to create more waste. And so
yeah.
Would you advise that a head of innovation or finance may need to second guess that process in relation to what it is that they're trying to execute from an innovation level, or what shareholders are asking them to do? Would you say have a little bit of gravity and pushback on that decision-making process?
Well, we already know that some major brands are asking people to sign NDAs not to use AI because it opens the brand up to liability. So there are liability factors, and we know that there are regulations coming. I mean, the question is, what kind of a conscience you have about the use of misleading your consumer? And, the reality is that almost 95% of the photographs that are taken of an actual sample on an actual physical model are pinned out in the back. There are very few brands that are really communicating the truth to their consumer. So I don't quite understand why they're surprised at their return rates, because they're not communicating clearly
Yeah,
from the very beginning. And 3D and AI have a real possibility of allowing that communication to be clarified. It can be clean, it can be honest, and it can be true and accurate. But if you're a head of innovation or a head of finance, you really need to do your due diligence about whether or not the tools that you're going to choose are actually going to have longevity. And that's the other part of it.
yeah,
How long is that tool really going to be viable and
yeah.
useful?
And to piggyback off of that, I will premise it as any data you put in, you must untrain. And in small language models, that can get sticky. And it gets even stickier in large language models with relation to AI. So it's very important to have the truth of whatever it is that works, not assumption, but what works be correct, because if it's going into a small language model, which is internal, it is based off the brand's own data, that they would then be able to recall that information as needed and adjust it accordingly and do all of that stuff. So from my perspective, brands are having to invest almost as much money, if not equal amounts of money, into the untraining of data because it was not the truth of something. And that's it's kind of like, would I use AI to, teach children who have special needs without having all the data there to really understand the nuances of each special need, right? Like I probably wouldn't want to do that. So that's where I think brands will always have to have an understanding that there's got to be a human element in the design process, making a lot of those judgment calls on the final run through of anything. Because at the end of the day, if we just all say, well, it was the machine's fault, right, that's kind of dispelling responsibility. And quite honestly, uh clothing, in my opinion, is part of Maslow's hierarchy of need. It's a base need, meaning shelter of some sort. So clothing is a shelter piece. And because of that, there should always be a human component functioning the main control of something. And we utilize all of the technologies to obviously help us, but understanding the truth and efficacy of those tools is going to equal a positive outcome in relation to what the customer gets, how the customer is communicated to, and ultimately the archive of the brand, right? Because as brands, we should be archiving whatever we do.
Should be, yes.
That's hard to do when you're white labeling everything.
Yes. Well, thank you, Katie.
Yeah,
I always enjoy our conversations.
I think it was a great conversation, and hopefully, people that are the head of innovation or finance can get some clear insights on what it is that pattern engineers and technical designers need from their higher ups in order to be more successful at their jobs on I think, a daily basis, but also a continued learning basis.
I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Oh.